The other day, I made a 13-second video joking about updating you all on the bricks and minifigs situation. Then I announced Chris and I would not be performing at the Freedom 250 rally in DC. It was a joke, people. No, we were not asked. No, I am neither Millie nor Vanilli. And while that's sad, I've been assured we can blame it on the rain. I spent today, like a lot of folks closely watching the situation, watching hours of dashcam footage and taking notes. It was as boring as it sounds, so I don't have an update about the bricks and minifigs situation. But I do have something related that I wanted to bring to your attention. The other night, when I was in one of those low points in the emotional roller coaster of all of this, worried that BAM's triple down would mean defending ourselves from a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for the offense of telling the truth and shining a light on their corporate behavior, I sat down and I wrote a poem. Yes, that quick recap video that you watched, that was a poem. Now, I know some of you are saying, this fucking guy tricked me twice. I don't like poetry. I get that. I was a high school English teacher. I've heard a lot of people say they don't like poetry. But before you get too pissed at me, consider this. In a few weeks, you're on a first date. Your date says they're into poetry and asks what poems you like. You're thinking, oh, fuck, I haven't read a poem since high school. Will I ruin this date if I say Shakespeare? First, no shade. Our school system does not do a good job of teaching poetry. You may have been lucky enough to have a teacher or two who did a really good job of it. If so, try to remember their names, look them up, send them a short thank you note. You will make them so happy. But too often we teach poetry from the approved curriculum. And that means a committee of people all agreed it's old, it's safe, and it's irrelevant to every student except the one kid who's going to go on to major in English Lit. We should be teaching poetry that's contemporary, that's controversial, and that's relevant. And I'll bet if you had a teacher who made poetry cool, those were the kinds of poems they shared with you, right? And now, on your date, you can say, I was just reading this poem the other day. It was about this whole Star Wars Lego thing. Have you heard about that? And then you can change the subject to Star Wars or Lego, and let's be honest. If the person doesn't like either Star Wars or Lego, then your dislike of poetry is not the biggest red flag at the table. But if they are pushing for more poetry talk, and you're really attracted to them, try this out. Be honest, of course. Never start a relationship with deception. That never ends well. But there's nothing wrong with dressing up for a date, literally and figuratively, so give this a try. Admit you're not a big fan of poetry. Then maybe talk about how most of your exposure to poetry is in song lyrics. No shame in that either. Yes, technically they're slightly different art forms, not because one is better than the other, but because lyricists have to concern themselves with how the words fit with the music. It's like a sculptor who works with a hammer and a chisel on a block of marble, and one who works with a chainsaw on a big block of ice. Both art, both sculpture, both require a ton of talent, and in my opinion, both badass, but they're different. And then you can tell this date you recognize your dislike of poetry is cultural. I'm guessing not many of you live in countries where poetry is one of the most popular art forms. And there's a reason for that. A poet will be as popular as a rock star in some countries, like Egypt and Russia and Iran. Sensing a pattern? Sure, long linguistic traditions dating back before English was a language. But I think there's another connection. Repressive regimes. You can tell this date about the poem you were reading the other day, and you did read it. Remember, people who are visually impaired read. However you read, it's reading. Reading a film as a text, listening to an audiobook, Braille, they all count. You read it, and you can talk about how the poem was designed to get around a gag order. And it got you thinking about how poetry can be a mechanism to say things we're not supposed to say. And if your date is a poetry fan, that will probably get them to go off on a whole bunch of different ways cool modern poetry is subversive. And you'll realize this date, in addition to being attractive enough to talk about poetry with, is also punk as fuck, and you'll find them 10 times hotter. Because here's one of the things that's so cool about poetry. Sure, they're short. Shorter than novels, shorter than most short fiction. But that doesn't mean they're easy. They're often difficult on purpose. They don't give you all the answers. My poem that you read was actually a pretty bad poem in that regard because it was too clear. The best poems make you work even harder. And then you're invested. You did the mental work and your brain is stronger for it. So, if you were trying to speak out in some kind of repressive system, whether you lived in Egypt under the former military dictator, or the current theocratic oppressive regime in Iran, or the criminal business oligarchy in Russia, Or if you were just some former high school English teacher in a shithole apartment in Portland looking down the barrel of an attack from a multi-million-dollar corporation that is pledged to make your life shit and was brazen enough to do it on a recorded phone call, a poem would be a great way to get people to think about how you feel, to feel it themselves, and then some percentage of them care. Not just enough to hit a like button, though that is cool. Not just enough to put a supportive message in the comments, though that is even cooler. Not just enough to give to a GoFundMe, though that is fucking huge, but enough to maybe change the way you think. To start to see that this kind of corporation or government or global system is worth pushing back against. And that there are literally tens of thousands of people who read the same poem you did, who did the same mental work, and who now stand shoulder to shoulder with you. So, find some more subversive poetry. Support those contemporary punk-as-fuck poets. They may come up on your For You page now that you've watched a video with a poem and a video about a poem. I may have fucked with your algorithm. You're welcome.